And good morning, happy American history students. Surviving Coronapocalypse 2020. So we finally got America into this war with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so the next big question of, once America is in, what exactly are we going to do with it? We had a lot of dilemmas. Number one dilemma is we were suddenly in a war, but America was never ever prepared for war. One of the most root beliefs of the founding fathers was we should never ever have a standing army. Um, Remember, George Washington stepped down because he didn't want the presidents to be too powerful. Thomas Jefferson was adamant against having a standing army or standing navy. The only one of the 27 amendments that has never been challenged in the Supreme Court is the Third Amendment, which is no quartering. We were so fed up with the British by 1776 because they were quartering soldiers in our homes that we were adamant to never have that same problem. That the problem with a standing army is one, it costs a whole lot of money, and you got to house them, you have to feed them, you have to supply them, and so the British cut the corner of housing them by forcing them into our homes with the Quartering Act, which we hated so much we've agreed on the Third Amendment for the last 230-ish years. The other problem with the standing army is most kings, at least back in those days, would use a standing army against their own people. And so one of the ways that we limited our own government was if you never have a standing army, then the president or the Congress can never use it against our own people, which was a big deal in the mind of the founding fathers. This is indeed why they have the Second Amendment. Has really nothing to do with hunting. They wanted guns in people's homes because we were the army to protect ourselves from foreign invasion and our own government. So American military history is really not that strong. We go into the War of 1812 without an army at first. We declare war, then we build an army, try to invade Canada 3 times. We fail all 3 times. The British invade Washington, D.C. and burn it down. Napoleon's escape saves us, along with Colonel Jackson and pirates and hillbillies at the Battle of New Orleans. Civil War comes along. No, wait, let's the Mexican War before that. More soldiers died in the Mexican War of disease than from the actual battles because we declared war on Mexico, then thought, oh, we need an army. Let's throw an army together. And we had so many volunteers we could not properly house and feed them all. And they died of disease more than combat. Civil War comes along. Both sides asked for very short enlistments. They thought the war was going to be over just like that. We just weren't prepared for the Civil War at all. Same for the Spanish-American War. Same for World War I. We declared war in April of 1917. We show up in France in 1918, just in time to stop the Germans from once again seizing Paris in the Second Battle of the Marne. So here we are in World War II, and we don't have an army. It takes about a year after Pearl Harbor to get an army together and launch our first operations. And those first operations, Operation Torch, will be our subject of the day. Before we get to that, you have to get to know these guys. Surely, if I asked in class, can you name these guys? You probably could because their names are right on the picture. This is Winston Churchill. He would appear as an old bulldog type of character. He is the stubborn British Prime Minister who refuses to allow England to surrender, even though they're being just pummeled by the Germans, the Battle of Britain. It's Churchill that holds England together. He screamed between the world wars that the way to peace was not to throw your guns in the ocean, not to sink your battleships after World War One. You may believe World War One is the end of the war to end all wars, but his strategy was if you want to end all wars, always have more guns than your enemy, and then your enemy won't mess with you. The road to peace then was through power, which we have essentially practiced since World War II. Then you have, remember, Churchill's also the Teddy Roosevelt of England. He's the prime minister before World War One. He learned to fly airplanes. Like Teddy Roosevelt was the first president up in an airplane. Winston Churchill wasn't happy to. He's actually learning to fly the airplanes. He escaped the Boer War, that whole story. He's this adventurous guy. He had this very vigorous youth, but he's older by World War II. Still gets up at 5 a.m. every day, cracks open a brand new bottle of brandy or scotch, smoked about 20 cigars a day, just this tough old warhorse. Then you have Franklin Roosevelt in the middle here, which is interesting. He's in the middle between our allies. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, is the only president elected for more than 2 terms. To give you an idea of his personality, he, of course, had that little wheelchair situation, which was fairly kept hidden from the public. What he saw from the Great Depression when he ran for office in 1932 was an opportunity to become president. It was his one chance to ever become president because of his polio and disabilities. He seized that moment and made himself president in 1932. His model in life had always been his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. They were fairly far apart cousins. Franklin was a young man when Teddy was president of the United States, and he wanted to model his life completely off his distant cousin Teddy, who he called Uncle Teddy, actually. He went to Harvard just like Teddy. He got involved in the same programs at Harvard, the same clubs at Harvard. He studied Navy stuff like Teddy did. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. He even made a trip on Navy ships to Europe just to see the fighting. Never involved in the fighting. His ship was involved in a little submarine combat on the way home. He just wanted to be like Teddy, the seagoing, adventurous type of president. In fact, he wanted to be like Teddy so much, he marries Teddy's niece, Eleanor Roosevelt. They were both named Roosevelt before they were married. Eleanor's father, just a thing in the Roosevelt family, was extreme alcoholism. Teddy's brother was an extreme alcoholic, died of alcoholism, and so Teddy took on the raising of Eleanor Roosevelt. They were a family of millionaires, and if you really want to have some fun, go Google some images of Eleanor Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt side by side. They have the exact same smile. Franklin married Eleanor Roosevelt more out of the political power, the political convenience, more so than just outright love. He's really just trying to be like his Uncle Teddy. And then on the side, they both had their girlfriends. Time goes on, and Franklin Roosevelt is the golden boy of the Democratic Party. He's running for vice president by 1920. Didn't have a snowball's chance in the microwave because after World War I, the Progressive Era, the Republicans and laissez-faire were going to dominate in that 1920s that we spent so much time with that stock market, that Republican laissez-faire atmosphere. FDR does not get elected in the 20s, but he's stricken with polio, and that's going to basically ruin his political future. The doctors told him he would never walk again, and Franklin Roosevelt just would not accept that prognosis. He worked out and worked out and worked out. His legs were useless, so he swam. He lifted weights. He made his upper body just like the character Joe from Family Guy. He never walked again. The doctors were correct. But he built up his upper body so much he could hold himself up at a podium and give a 2 or 3 hour speech just on arm strength and with some steel leg braces to keep his legs straight. And then off to the right, you of course got, well, I'll go back to Teddy or Franklin for a minute. The Great Depression crashes the economy in 1929. He uses that as an opportunity to become governor of New York, just like his Uncle Teddy did. And from there, he springboarded into the presidency because nobody wanted to be president in 1932. It was his one chance as a disabled American to become president. He seizes that moment, and he goes to the whole New Deal program that we talked about with the Great Depression unit. Has some success in relieving the Great Depression, but we were caught in that dilemma of the factories wouldn't hire because nobody was buying because they didn't have jobs because the factories weren't hiring, and this loop just goes on until World War II, which is the ultimate example of Keynesian economics. He serves his 2 terms. The Depression it's better, but not perfect. It's time for Franklin Roosevelt to roll out of office. I'll give you an idea of what kind of personality he has. He sort of looks around the country at all the available people that could replace him as president, and he comes to the conclusion that nobody's good enough. He's the only person in America that could lead us through the rest of the Depression, and he saw the looming war clouds on the horizon, so he runs for a 3rd term. But the trick there is you're going to come off extraordinarily arrogant if you run for a third term. George Washington himself had said 2 was enough. Every president since George Washington has respected that precedent. It was never law. Never law. Every president voluntarily respected the precedent, or the few that tried to run for a third term. Van Buren and Grant, for example, were shot down by the voters who did not want anybody to have a third term. So here's Franklin Roosevelt thinking, I'm the only guy good enough. I have to run for a third term, but not look like an arrogant jerk. And so as the Democratic Party convention is meeting in Chicago in 1940, preparing for that election, they're very, very divided. There's multiple candidates who want to fill Roosevelt's shoes, but nobody has enough to gain the nomination. So Roosevelt, this really tells you his personality. He sneaks a guy into the convention, hooked up to a microphone. The guy's in the basement, and as the convention, we're talking 40 or 50,000 people screaming and yelling, arguing over who should be the Democratic nominee in 1940. Roosevelt has this guy with the microphone hooked into the system start chanting very, very quietly, very subtle, Roosevelt, subliminal messages, Roosevelt, 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 Roosevelt. It starts chanting this into the microphone system, and people catch on, and next thing you know, you got 40,000 people screaming Roosevelt in this convention center, and they all come to the grand conclusion, the only guy we can unify around and get us through the next 4 years is Roosevelt. We'll have to make precedent. They call Franklin, who's back in Washington, D.C., and they say, well, we know it's out of the ordinary, but we just think you're the only guy. The people are begging you to run for a third term. And Roosevelt totally pulls a George Washington and says, oh, my heart is melting. It's unusual to run for a third term. And George Washington said we couldn't, but just like George Washington, if the people are going to beg me to be president, I just don't have a choice. I will have to give in to the will of the people and serve as a third term president. And he wins the election of 1940. Of course, then World War II breaks out. He's up for election again in 1944. One of the bizarrest things about America is we practice democracy in the middle of the worst world crises like war. He runs for a 4th term in 1944 on the premise that you don't want to change horses in the middle of a stream. We're in the middle of the biggest war fought by mankind, so you may as well elect me a 4th time. Of course, in his mind, he's also saying, I'm the only person that can do this. Even though by 1944 his health was so poor, Franklin Roosevelt certainly knew he had to be on the verge of death. People that visited him would see the ashen gray color in his hands of his poor circulation. His body was just physically giving out. He was doomed to die, and he probably knew it, and still believed he was the only person capable of running America for that 4th term. Good evidence of that is he did not choose a capable replacement for himself even. He chose the man from Missouri, Harry Truman, who was considered pretty much a failure his whole life. Did not choose Truman on his political abilities. He chose Truman on the idea that I need somebody from the Midwest who has Southern roots, who has Western roots, has Midwestern roots, and get me more votes so I can win this 4th term. And now we should talk about Uncle Joe over here to the side. He is the dictator of Russia, Joseph Stalin. He makes Hitler look like the Diet Coke of evil. He just kept his crimes a little more secret than Hitler. Hitler, of course, is terrible. He murders 11 million people. Uncle Joe probably killed 50 million of his own Russians between 1925 or so and 1955 or so, his 30-year dictatorship of Russia. He takes over the Russian Revolution after Vladimir Ilyich Lenin dies. Possibly, because Russia's such a closed society, we can't 100% prove this, but last biography I read on Stalin was pretty strong on Lenin had a stroke in the mid-1920s and was incapacitated, and so his sidemen, Joe Stalin was the hammer, the muscle behind the Russian Revolution. Leon Trotsky was the brains behind the Russian Revolution. Lenin has a stroke without really naming his heir. And so Trotsky and Stalin are just wondering, okay, which one of us is supposed to take over, the brains or the muscle? Lenin gets better. So problem solved. Then Lenin had a stroke. And Trotsky and Stalin were wondering, okay, which one's supposed to take over? But then Lenin got better. But then Lenin had a stroke. And this went on until Joe Stalin probably just took a pillow and smothered Lenin to death to solve the problem. Trotsky got the hint and moved to Mexico and various South American countries until he woke up one day with his throat cut, and that made Joe Stalin the indisputable dictator of Russia. Stalin probably didn't give a hoot about communism. He cared about Russia. Russia suffered the most in World War I. He wants to strengthen Russia and make sure they're never slaughtered like that again. And so he becomes just a terrible, horrifying dictator. When the farmers of Russia between the World Wars said, we don't want to share our crops, we'll just refuse to farm, he just said, that's fine, just starve. And he starved the country to death until farmers started farming again. When he wanted to be sure the military was on his side, he slaughtered most of the Russian officers in the military so he could appoint new officers to be loyal to him. They would owe their position to him, and so he would have a stronger army loyal to him. The downside is as soon as he did that, Hitler was taking power and starting World War II, and Stalin was not prepared for that, and that's why he signed that Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact talked about in previous videos. Stalin's not quite ready for World War II because he just slaughtered his officers. So he's a tough guy. Now, the point of this picture is these three guys, they have to all get along to win World War II. If you remember, ruthlessly throughout the year, I've tried to teach you my history sign language. There is Louisiana, and there's two-front war, and of course there's Turtle, which you don't need anything for, but two-front war. To defeat Germany, you always have to have a two-front war. Russia always has to be our ally, which is why England and France included the BFSS Russia in their original Triple Entente of World War I. The problem is then Russia does so poorly in World War I that the Entente falls apart. Russia drops out of the war and stabs England and France in the back. They had that communist revolution stabbing England and France in the back. We literally, America and England and France sent soldiers into Russia to kill Joseph Stalin and V.I. Lenin and destroy the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution. And now here we are again in World War II, and those countries have to be friends again. The point of this picture is to show you these guys have to be friends in World War II. They have to work together to create the two-front war that will destroy Adolf Hitler. And this picture is so telltale. Franklin Roosevelt in the middle. America was the glue that everybody needed. We had all the resources. We had all the money. England is small. Churchill is tough, but he's so stubborn, and England's so small. He knows geographically America needs England, but 90% of it is England needs America. So they are very, very buddy. Stalin, who you can see looking off in the other direction while these guys are probably telling jokes and old war stories and laughing, Stalin feels totally out of the loop here. He's staring off to the other side. He is removed. Look how much more formal Stalin is and uncomfortable Stalin is, clasping his hands. Roosevelt here is very, very relaxedly putting his hand on his knee. He's smoking a cigarette, of course. Churchill's having a cigar. They're all buddy. And Stalin is squeezed out here. The biggest danger, besides Hitler and Japan of World War II, is that we would fight each other. Of course, I'm also planting seeds here for the Cold War after this. We hold the alliance together through World War II, but it was a very shaky alliance, was never very solid ground. It took a lot of wrangling to keep these three guys together. They have more ego between the three of them than the rest of the planet put together. And so it was very, very, very shaky ground this alliance was built upon. Which is why we gotta move on. Which is why we have a picture of this guy. Does anybody know who this guy is? That is Dwight David Eisenhower. And this picture in particular is chosen because if you look at Eisenhower, look at that terrific smile. He was known for that terrific smile. When he runs for president later, the campaign slogan is always "I like Ike." Every Eisenhower ever from Kansas was nicknamed Ike because Eisenhower is a long and cumbersome name. Eisenhower graduated the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1917, just in time to not participate in World War I. This puts Eisenhower in an odd position. A lot of officers older than him and more senior to him gained combat experience in World War One. Guys such as Douglas MacArthur, who was running the Philippines before World War II broke out and was the highest ranking officer in the United States Army. He'd been there the longest. He had this brilliant reputation from World War I as an infantry officer. He led the first division we took to World War I, called the Rainbow Division, because it was made up of men from every state and every unit. They mixed it up so no one state or unit got the honor of being the first to World War I. Just this incredibly legendary officer who stood under fire and did some outrageously brave things throughout World War I. Another legendary officer is George S. Patton from World War One, who was a tank guy in World War One, who linked up with MacArthur, and it was MacArthur's infantry and Patton's tanks, which led to the final victories that made the Germans want to negotiate an end to World War One. Patton comes home bragging about tanks, 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 tanks to win the next war, to which Congress will always tell him that, no, we're not going to be in any more wars, America's going isolationist, so Patton shipped off to an obscure Pennsylvania military base and virtually forgotten about. There was Billy Mitchell, who would have been a senior officer to Dwight Eisenhower, but he came back from World War I bragging about airplanes, and he pushed it to the point that the Army court-martialed him for pushing for more weapons like airplanes for the next big war. And that's where Patton got the clue of, I better just shut it and move off to my obscure Pennsylvania military base, or I'll get court-martialed too. So all these guys would have been superior to Eisenhower for World War II, but Eisenhower gets the job of Supreme Allied Commander because of this smile. Eisenhower was a social character. He went off to West Point as sort of the jock, athlete, football type who got along with everybody. He was sort of George Washington in this regard. One of George Washington's great strengths was he always knew he wasn't the smartest guy in the room. So you shut up and listen to the smartest guys in the room. You don't have to talk all the time. But one of the greatest things I've learned in life, probably by going to meetings as such, is that the people that talk all the time, a lot of times, are definitely not the smartest people in the room. The people that listen and absorb. They're picking up better ideas from all the people that talk and formulating combination ideas that are even better. Washington had that gift, and Eisenhower is pretty close there. Was not known at West Point for being scholarly. He was known for skipping class, smoking cigarettes, and just having a good time. He does graduate. He was confident, but he was not really meant to be a great strategist like Robert E. Lee or Napoleon or Jackson or even Patton. He is chosen for this job because of this smile. He gets along with everybody. He is made Supreme Allied Commander to keep these three guys getting along throughout World War II. Eisenhower can make people happy. He was well known for saying there's only one person ever in life he actually hated, and that was Hitler. Everybody else in the world he could get along with. Alright, so here's our main characters. Now that we're actually in the war, there's the big question of, what do? We don't have an army, we don't have experience. What do we do? This is really two wars being fought at once. Just what in the world do we do? So FDR's basic strategic premise was focus on Hitler first. This is a tough sell on the American people because it was Japan that bombed Pearl Harbor. But what FDR is arguing is Hitler is the bigger danger. If we go back to the very beginning of this unit, I have argued over and over again that Japan's biggest weakness was resources. The longer the war goes on, the weaker Japan gets. So FDR is saying, we'll focus on Hitler and Germany first. He's getting incredibly powerful. He's conquered half of civilized Russia, he's got all of North Africa, he's conquered France, and he's bombing the crap out of England. He's just getting more powerful and more resources, while Japan is held up by the Chinese soaking up their bullets. So if we help England, we'll have an ally. And if we help Russia, we'll have an ally if we focus on Hitler first and save those countries. That was a tough sell on the American people because it was Japan that bombed Pearl Harbor, and the people wanted revenge on Japan. It was a tough sell to Congress. Hitler helped us out by declaring war the day after Pearl Harbor, so that kind of helps up. So grand strategy is hold Japan basically in a headlock, don't let them expand, don't let them get resources, and focus most of our efforts on Hitler first. But then you run into the more specific strategical problem of We know we need a two-front war to defeat Hitler. That means invading France. The American idea is we must invade France, and then we'll say France is an ally, and have a direct two-front war against Hitler. The problem with that is America's not going to be able to get into the war until late 1942, almost a year after Pearl Harbor. This means that Hitler has held the coasts of France for 2 solid years. He's building a thing called the Atlantic Wall. We would have to pit our brand new, inexperienced soldiers against Hitler's best if we open a second front in France. And that could lead to slaughter in our first battles. And if you get slaughtered in your first battles, remember, America didn't want to fight Hitler at all. They would start asking questions like, why are we fighting Hitler? He really isn't a threat to us. It's Japan that bombed Pearl Harbor. And so we come up with an alternative plan called Operation Torch, which is the invasion of North Africa. We're going to move things around just a little bit to talk about the invasion of North Africa. I know you guys are enjoying the fancy tours of my basement. There's some of my guitars. There's my gold record. And there's the 382 books I've read on history in my library. But I know what you're missing the most. This is my improvised maps that we do on the chalkboards at school. And my gosh, this video is running long, but we'll be there in 10 minutes or so. It will be kind of a long one. You do have the option of just reading the presentations. So, let's draw a little map of North Africa here. There's the western coast, there's the bay where Libya is, and over here would be the Nile Delta. And of course you got your pyramids. There's 3 great pyramids here. And the British are desperately holding the Germans off at El Alamein. Out here, you got the Germans, who have come down from Italy. A lot of Italian soldiers actually here. This is where Hitler let the Italians play. And so, what you have going on in North Africa is Hitler is desperately trying to take the pyramids of Egypt. No, not exactly. Pyramids have no military value. But if you remember, if you ever learned it actually, over here is a thing called the Suez Canal, which attaches, this of course is the Mediterranean Sea up here, attaches the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, where if the Germans can capture the British-built and British-owned Suez Canal, the German Navy can escape out the Red Sea, go down to the Indian Ocean, and link up with the Japanese, their ally. Plus, you have the entire oil supply of the world right there in the Middle East. And so the Germans are desperately trying to take Egypt and break through into the Middle East. The British are desperately trying to prevent them. And that's the whole significance of the Battle of El Alamein, where, with our help, the British will hold out right there. Out here in the middle, leading the Germans, is a dude named Erwin Rommel, who is known as the Desert Fox. Rommel is one of the great characters of World War II. He was the German that came out of World War I, insisting that tanks would be the next great weapon. And while Patton was being ignored in America, Rommel was being listened to by Hitler and the Germans. And he literally writes the book on tank tactics between the world wars. And Germany develops the finest tanks made up to that point in time. And so the British have their hands full with Erwin Rommel right there in the middle of Africa. And so to prevent America from having to have our troops slaughtered on the beaches of France, Winston Churchill proposes, why don't you start in Africa with this Operation Torch? There's a thing over here called the Atlas Mountains. If American forces would invade here for Operation Torch, that would force Rommel to split his forces out there in the middle of Africa and create a mini two-front war in Africa. It would help the British, it would give us some experience, and once we take North Africa, Hopefully this will look very familiar to you. The Italian boot is right up here. And the key to controlling the Mediterranean is always the island of Sicily. And so what this plan would allow us to do is divide Rommel's forces, crush him in North Africa, step to Sicily, step to Italy, and drive up into the soft underbelly of Germany. My metaphor for this plan is horrifying. I call it the turtle plan. Hopefully you will have no idea what I'm talking about except for some basic biology. You know turtles have a hard shell on their back. That is France. That is the top of Germany. The northern German coast, the French coast, that's the hard shell of the turtle. If you wanted to kill a turtle and tried to stab it in the back, your knife would bounce off the hard shell trying to hit it in the back. If you want to kill a turtle, you turn it upside down, you stab it in the softer belly of the underside. That's what we're doing here. Crush the Germans in North Africa, skip to Sicily, skip to Italy, and stab up into the soft underbelly of Germany. So, Eisenhower launches Operation Torch. Our first problem is it's actually the French who have joined Hitler after being conquered by Hitler. Hitler, remember, threatened them with, I'll melt down the Eiffel Tower, make tanks of it, and I'll draw a mustache on the Mona Lisa if you don't join me. And so we were really hoping the French soldiers would just step aside and just let us invade North Africa. The French soldiers were afraid, if we don't put up somewhat of a fight, Hitler will slaughter all of us for letting him down after agreeing to join him. And so the French fight just enough at the beaches so they can tell Hitler, look, we tried. Too many Americans. They won. And so we succeed in invading North Africa. And the British win this all-important Battle of El Alamein. They're pushing Rommel back this way, while we're pushing this way. But Rommel finds an advantage here at a place called Kasserine. Narrow mountain passes are a good place to attack the American army, and he slaughters us in our first battle at Kasserine Pass. Remember, I said Eisenhower is not a great military strategist. He's no Napoleon. He's no Rommel for sure. And what he's done, his main job is keeping everybody happy. He's put the best officers he believes he has in charge at Kasserine, but when he goes out to investigate, why the American army is slaughtered, he discovered his generals were digging underground bunkers 20 miles behind the lines to hide in. And this is just a military travesty. A good general must be up front, must be with his soldiers, must be directing the battle. But of course that's dangerous, especially when you're fighting Erwin Rommel. So America realizes that part of the problem is our leadership. We got bad generals, and we have inexperienced soldiers, and our biggest problem is we're fighting the greatest tank commander of all time. And so Eisenhower must find a tank commander. And this is where we enter into the show one of the greatest characters of World War II. Everybody has heard this name, I am certain of that. Eisenhower must look around in America for somebody that knows how to use tanks. And he knew there was one guy in America that knew how to use tanks. And that man was George S. Patton. He is one of the most unique American figures of all time. Here's a close-up. You can tell a lot about his personality. He is a serious military character. I like this other close-up better here. This gives you an idea of who George S. Patton really is. This is a portrait where he's of course showing off his finest, but little detail here, that is not a military issue handgun. That is a ivory handled cowboy 6-shooter. And this totally describes George S. Patton's personality. He is a cowboy, he is a rebel, he is an individualist. He grew up extraordinarily rich in California. He had a pretty easy life growing up. He got a great education. He did suffer from dyslexia, and he had to figure that out on his own, which impacted not only his education but his emotions and his mood swings as a human being. But Patton makes quite a success out of himself. Um, I usually have a little discussion in class at this point of, have you ever met somebody that is better than you? Now, I phrased that very carefully. I did not say, have you ever met anybody that thinks they're better than you? I said, have you ever met somebody that is better than you? When you meet somebody that thinks they're better than you, it's easy to say, well, they think they're better than me, but they're just a horrible human being, and I'm as good as them in every way. The problem is, Patton is better than you. He is better than me. He is better than everyone. He is smarter than everyone. He is faster than everyone. He's a better athlete than everyone. He is just the ultimate military machine. That the guy was literally an Olympic athlete. And he competed in the pentathlon, which is a 5-event thing where you horseback ride, and he was a master horseman, just a super superb master horseman. You sword fight. He loved that because of the historical aspects. And you ran and you swam. If you've ever done a mile swim, you know how exhausting a mile swim is. And running long distance and then swimming long distance is, takes a huge toll on the body. And the final event was pistol shooting. The legend about Patton, and it really is actually more legend than truth, was that he put one hole through the target of his pistol shooting event, dead through the bullseye, and when the judges scored it, they only found one hole through the dead center of the bullseye. So legend has it that Patton did not get a gold medal because his remaining bullets went all through the same hole. He was so good. He was too good. It's why he didn't get a gold medal. The actual truth is, his arms are tired from the running and especially from the swimming. He didn't perform as well as he would have liked to in the Olympics, but he's still an Olympian. How many people in the world can ever say they are an Olympian? And so he's physically better than most people, and mentally he is a powerhouse of IQ. The man studied war his entire life. In addition to studying war, he wrote about war. This is one of the real quirks of George S. Patton. He loved to write poetry, so he's this manly man writing poetry. But his poetry was all about war and battles. War and battles. The man truly believed in reincarnation. This, besides his arrogance and his pompousness, this is what pushed people away from George S. Patton in the Army. He truly believed in reincarnation. He truly believed that he was a soldier in every world history event-turning battle ever fought by mankind, and he would write poetry about these battles. He really believed he was with the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae when they all died, saving Greek civilization in the Persian Wars. He believed he died in all these battles doing something heroic. He truly, truly would have believed he was the Scipio Africanus, saving the Roman civilization against the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War. He truly believed he would have been at the Battle of Agincourt, fighting between the English and the French. He truly believed that he would have been in the American Revolution and died in some heroic role that saves America and makes us the dominant civilization on Earth. He truly believed that he was in the American Civil War and would have done something heroic at one of the great battles like Chancellorsville or Fredericksburg or Gettysburg, changing the course of human civilization. So he would write poetry about this, want to read his poetry to people, and he just really weirded people out with his intense, over-intense personality. Surely you've met somebody by now in the world with such an intense personality that it's hard to be around them. They're just so intense about everything, and that is George S. Patton. And then he goes off to World War One. He's our tank guy in World War One, and it's his tanks that link up with Douglas MacArthur's infantry that made the final pushes to break the German back and get them to finally negotiate an end to World War One. So he's certainly going to come back from World War One screaming, tanks, 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 tanks. Tanks are the next wave of the future. We must invest in tanks. We must research tanks. They're going to be the thing that wins the next war. Just like Rommel was doing in Germany. Problem in America is nobody is listening to him. We were going isolationist. Billy Mitchell was saying the same thing about airplanes. He got court-martialed. MacArthur even sat on that court-martial committee and voted for his dismissal from the Army. Patton realizes, holy crap, everything's against me right now. I need to just shut it up. He was smart enough to shut it up, accepts a position at an obscure Pennsylvania military base, where he was given a few men and some trucks and some plywood, and told to screw the plywood to the trucks and play tanks all he wants, and he spends 20 years between World War One and World War Two trying to sort things out with tanks, but believing actually that his life has become a failure. He was meant to die in World War One. He was supposed to die, changing the course of history in World War One, and he doesn't. So he becomes incredibly depressed during the interwar period. That's part of dyslexia too. Is dyslexia is a reading disorder, but it also greatly plays on the emotions of a person and gives them mood swing attitude problems, and that was part of Patton's attitude problems. So he's just horribly depressed between World War and World War Two. He is certain that something is going to happen to put him back on track of his destiny. And so, Operation Torch happens. We invade North Africa. American soldiers are slaughtered at the Kasserine. Eisenhower needs somebody to fight the greatest tank commander of all time, Erwin Rommel. Eisenhower knows there's one man in the entire United States Army that can help him. That man is George S. Patton. They knew each other. Eisenhower was briefly, after graduating West Point, he was briefly assigned to Patton's Pennsylvania base. Realizes it's a go-nowhere assignment. Remember, Eisenhower's that social character, and he's going to use his social skills to climb the ladder. And so he gets transferred away from Patton as soon as possible, realizing that Patton is a dead-end road. Gets himself to the Philippines with MacArthur, this other great military general, and he climbs the military ladder with MacArthur, who's so awesome. MacArthur's dad won the Congressional Medal of Honor in the Civil War. MacArthur wins the Congressional Medal of Honor after World War One. And so Eisenhower's riding the MacArthur coattails and abandons Patton. But now he needs George S. Patton. And this picture is so telltale. Look at each face. Patton is so proud. This is his shining moment. He is going to fix the world and probably die trying, and he is so happy about it in this picture. Eisenhower is smiling, as always, but there's a hint of seriousness in Eisenhower's face here. He's smiling, but it's almost like he's gritting his teeth saying, George, we need you, but you are crazy as an outhouse bat. Don't screw this up. None of the reincarnation stuff. Don't do anything. My job is